Designed by William Kent in the late 18th century and located in the affluent district of Mayfair, 50 Berkeley Square has a long-standing reputation for being London's most haunted house. Since 1750, it has served as a private home and as business premises. It was home to Prime Minister George Canning, who lived in the property until his death at his office at Chiswick House in 1827. He was the first to experience paranormal activity at 50 Berkeley Square and recorded in his diary that he'd witnessed unexplained sounds and disturbing psychic phenomena. The house struggled to be let long-term in the mid-19th century, which, considering its prime location, makes one wonder what was really going on behind its impressive Georgian facade. Something awful was said to reside in this house, something so horrific it had scared people to death. Over the years, stories have been published, embellished, changed and debunked, but to this day, ghost hunters and paranormal investigators are often seen outside the property, hoping to glimpse something supernatural. Today, we will look at the numerous ghost stories connected to this impressive London home. Welcome to the ghosts of 50 Berkeley Square. The attic room of the house is said to be haunted by the ghost of a young lady named Catherine Adeline. In 1789, she was found dead, lying on the pavement outside the house. It is thought she jumped from the top floor to her death, screaming as she descended. But many believe that she is the victim of a murder and was brutally pushed to her death. Sadly, she had been suffering the inappropriate advances of her own uncle. Did she threaten to tell the authorities of her uncle's evil deeds? Did he or an accomplice decide to end the poor girl's life, making it look like she was to blame? Is it the case that she could no longer endure the situation and decided to take the ultimate route out? Passers-by have claimed to see the figure of a woman wearing a white dress and black boots, falling from the 4th story, but vanishing before hitting the pavement. Others have witnessed her clinging to the outside windowsill before losing her grip and falling before disappearing. So disturbing were these events, the local police began to log them. Inside the attic, she manifests in the form of a brown mist, though sometimes she is reported as a white figure who roams the corridors. But this is the first of a number of deaths at the property, and it seems the attic and the upper floors of the house are the most active. There are 2 versions of a story connected with a Mr. Dupree, believed to be a sadistic head servant. The first is that he locked a young kitchen assistant named Ethel in the attic, as he was unhappy with her slow working pace. After some time, she succumbed to the cold and died in the attic. In the second version, Mr. Dupree kept his brother, who was suffering from severe mental health problems, inside the attic rather than sending him to Bethlehem Hospital. He spent the last years of his life completely cut off from society and was passed meals through a hole in the floor until the meals stopped, leading to his death. Other stories linked to the attic include the ghost of a mysterious little girl. She is described as a toddler dressed in tartan with red tights and black shoes. The girl is thought to have died in her nursery on the top floor, where she was either scared to death or murdered by her nanny. She was described by author Jessie A. Middleton as a pathetic little wraith, sobbing and wringing her hands, who used to appear to the inmates until nobody dared to live in the house. Do these tragic apparitions contribute to 50 Berkeley Square's notorious haunted reputation? In 1827, the property was sold to the Right Honourable Elizabeth Curzon, who lived at the property until her death in 1859. During this time, a maid named Lydia Wilkinson, new to service and new to London and completely unaware of the property's haunted reputation, spent the night in the second-floor guest bedroom. The following day, she was found terrified and screaming. A doctor was called who diagnosed Lydia as insane, and she was subsequently placed in Bethlehem Psychiatric Hospital for the rest of her life. Is she the mysterious lady heard screaming late at night in this very room? By 1840, the stories of 50 Berkeley Square really started to spread across London and beyond. One evening, a 30-year-old nobleman and MP named Sir Robert Warboys was enjoying drinks with his friends at White's, the oldest and most exclusive club in London. The discussion moved on to all things supernatural, including the horrific haunting of 50 Berkeley Square, already in the public domain at this time. Warboys, being a sceptic, had heard rumours of the alleged hauntings and scoffed at the idea of ghosts. He dismissed the concept as utter piffle, but his friends were believers and dared him 100 guineas to spend the night alone in one of the bedrooms at 50 Berkeley Square. 3 evenings later, Sir Robert arrived at 50 Berkeley Square, ready to spend the night. The custodians at number 50 at that time were horrified and shocked at the idea, but finally agreed to the proposal on 2 conditions. The first was that Sir Robert would take a loaded pistol with him. The second, that he use the bell that summoned the servants if he required any assistance. The underlying question was, assistance with what? Sir Robert headed up the stairs at the end of the evening, and initially everything in the second-floor bedroom appeared to be normal. Warboys was confident he was going to prove his friends wrong. But shortly after midnight, the servant's bell began to ring. After a short pause, the bell began to ring furiously, and as the custodian and the man's friends rushed hurriedly up the stairs, a shot was heard. They raced to the room and flung open the door. Sir Robert was cowering in a corner, utterly petrified, gripping the pistol in his shaking hand, pointing it towards what had to have been something in the room moments before they arrived. His eyes were bulging from their sockets, and his face was deathly pale. He was unable to speak and died shortly afterwards. What had Robert Warboys encountered? A ghost, a demon, an entity. Something sinister, it seemed, lurked in the second-floor bedroom. Around 30 years later, in 1872, the aristocrat Lord George Littleton, a former MP, decided to stay the night at 50 Berkeley Square as he was conducting some business in Mayfair at that time. He was intrigued about the house's haunted reputation and, like many Victorians, fascinated with the paranormal, so he was excited to spend the night in the same room as Warboys. He firmly believed he could find the cause of the hauntings and wanted to communicate with whatever lurked in the house. But he was cautious and brought 2 shotguns loaded with buckshot and silver sixpences in an effort to gain protection from any evil forces that might ambush him in the process. Just after midnight, he heard a strange growling sound. He grabbed his shotgun and scanned the room, looking for the culprit. He witnessed a white mass of inhumanity, with tentacles, a cross between a sea creature and a human torso, dominating the shadows of the room, close to the bedroom window, and rapidly heading towards him. Suddenly, the creature lurched at him, and he fired his gun. The sound of the shot echoed through the otherwise tranquil Mayfair night. A keen hunter, he heard the heavy thud on the floorboard, a sound similar to a pheasant's body falling to the floor on a chute. He reloaded and was about to fire again, but all was quiet. The following day, he surveyed the room and found it to be empty. Whatever mass he was convinced he'd shot had disappeared. All that remained was a hole in the wall from a rifle shot and some sort of slimy residue where he'd seen the horrific creature. He left the house and vowed he'd never set foot over the threshold again. Rumours continued to spread throughout London that this house was not just haunted, but evil, and only brave souls could live or spend just one night within its walls. This attracted a man named Benjamin Smith, who was dared by his drinking companions at the Connaught to spend the night at number 50. He rose to the challenge, declared he had no fear of ghosts, and arrived at the property ready to spend the night. But, despite being a skeptic, he set up a bell system within the house, with one ring indicating fear, and two rings meaning, "I need help." His loyal friends had come along for moral support and set up watch inside the kitchen. Around midnight, Benjamin Smith retired to bed upstairs. But just 2 hours later, the bell began to ring continuously. Unable to interpret the meaning of this signal and feeling scared, the friends left Benjamin alone in his bedroom. During the night, he suffered from a massive heart attack, and the following morning was discovered dead in his bed, with the bell string still attached to his hand. The apparition of a man wearing fine clothes, breeches, and a silk jacket has been seen ascending and descending the stairs in the house. Is this the apparition of Warboys, Littleton, or Smith, forever trapped in the terror and anguish of this sinister place? On another occasion, the house was let to a couple of newlyweds. When their lease commenced, they were still abroad on their honeymoon, so the bride's mother travelled to London to ensure the house was ready for their return. She lived some distance from the city and decided to have an early night in one of the bedrooms. Around midnight, the servants heard piercing screams. They rushed up the stairs and found the poor woman dead in her bed, her eyes wide open, with a look of terror on her face. And there is a similar story. A sceptical man who stayed the night, along with his faithful companion, his dog. The dog was reluctant to enter the home, but eventually followed his master. The following morning, both were dead. Emily Curzon, an elderly spinster, said she'd never experienced any paranormal activity during her time at the townhouse. After she died of natural causes at the age of 91 in 1859, the property was leased to Thomas Myers, the somewhat eccentric son of an MP. He furnished the house with beautiful carpets, brand new luxurious furniture, sumptuous fabrics, and the finest bone china crockery. 50 Berkeley Square became the epitome of a modern, elegant London townhouse. These thorough preparations were made for his beautiful bride-to-be, and Myers spared no expense for her. But just days before the wedding, she ungraciously left him and married another man. Myers was distraught. He stayed at the house and became a recluse, unable to cope with the devastating news that had shattered his future dreams. He would sleep throughout the daytime, and at night he stalked the rooms of his home with a candle. His neighbours would witness his nocturnal vigils and often saw him drifting from room to room, a behaviour that many found most disturbing. After a number of years, he was heard shouting and making strange noises at night. The neighbours began to gossip. They were convinced that Myers was turning to black magic and the dark arts, either to punish his former fiancée or even win her affection back. Eventually, Myers was declared insane, and he spent his remaining days in a lunatic asylum. Myers left Berkeley Square in the early 1870s. In 1873, the local council summoned Mr. Myers of 50 Berkeley Square for unpaid taxes, but nobody proffered the outstanding money. Eventually, the house's formidable reputation as being haunted led to the charges being dropped, and once again the building became empty for many years. But despite being vacant, the neighbours would hear screams, moans, heavy furniture or boxes being dragged across floorboards, windows opening and closing, the servants' bells ringing, and glasses smashing. Some passers-by reported windows opening in the empty premises and projectiles such as stones and old books landing at their feet. On one occasion, a neighbour managed to obtain a key to number 50. He heard the servants' bells ringing and raced inside and down to the cellars. He witnessed the bells ringing and physically moving, but on inspection he found the house was actually empty. Media interest in 50 Berkeley Square became intense, with several magazines reporting that an entity had claimed the lives of several people at the property. The Mayfair magazine, on the 10th of May 1879, reported, "If there be physiognomy in bricks and mortar, one would say that house has seen murder done. A valuable house left seemingly to decay, with windows caked and blackened by dust, and yet with no notice about it anywhere that it may be had for renting. This is known as the haunted house in Berkeley Square." The house at Berkeley Square contains at least one room in which the atmosphere is supernaturally fatal to mind and body. A girl saw, heard and felt such terror in it that she went mad, and never recovered sanity enough to tell how or why. A gentleman, a disbeliever in ghosts, dared to sleep in it and was found a corpse in the middle of the floor after practically ringing for help in vain. Rumour suggests other cases of the same kind, all ending in death, madness or both, as the result of trying to sleep in that room. Another article from 1879, written by W.E. Howlett, suggests there is some sort of energy field or force within the walls. The very party walls of the house, when touched, are found to be saturated with electric horror. Could this explain the mysterious events at 50 Berkeley Square? The entity inside number 50 began to be called the Nameless Horror, and across the nation, members of the public were fascinated by the unfolding drama. The stories of demonic entities and wraiths made fascinating reading for those interested in the paranormal. Descriptions of the Nameless Horror varied. One newspaper described it as the ghost of a man with extremely horrible features, white and flabby, pierced by an enormous round mouth. This description is said to tally with the appearance of Mr. Dupre's brother. Another report described it as a reptile of darkness, a strange creature with many legs or tentacles that emerged from beneath Berkeley Square. Some speculate that the Nameless Horror was a mutant animal living in the network of sewers who'd become hideous due to toxins and pollutants. Other descriptions include a hideous, shapeless, oozing mass with talons or claws, moving on all fours. Some people believe this is a supernatural creature, whereas others are convinced it's a cryptid or a mutant cephalopod. In 1907, author Charles Harper wrote in Haunted Houses. The haunted house in Berkeley Square was long one of those things that no country cousin, come up from the provinces to London on sightseeing bent, ever willingly missed. Had warboys Littleton and Smith encountered the nameless horror? Many believed they had. In the early 1870s, 50 Berkeley Square stood derelict and became a real eyesore for the wealthy residents of Mayfair. In his book, Charles Harper described it as the very picture of misery. Elliot O'Donnell wrote that around this time, the sinister house caught the attention of two sailors on leave from HMS Penelope, which was docked in Portsmouth. Many of the sailors headed to London, and on one Christmas Eve, Edward Blunden and Robert Martin, having seen the To Let sign, broke into the property after a night out on the town. They had no money left for lodgings, and very quickly they made their way to one of the upper bedrooms. Neither could have been prepared for what happened that night. The men lit a fire in a grate using some old wooden Venetian blinds they discovered on the floor in one of the rooms. The fire was still flickering when the men both heard muffled footsteps coming up the stairs. Strangely, the footsteps began to change into a plop-plopping noise that sounded somewhat unhuman. Blunden began to hear the footsteps becoming very close, then a startling heavy dragging noise, and both men witnessed the door open by itself. A deep guttural growling sound was heard, and then it appeared. A heavy, shapeless mass, with a face barely resembling a middle-aged man and a gaping mouth, entered the room. The unknown figure made a strange squelching noise as it approached, and had large outspread claws. The creature took up position between the bed and the door, obstructing the only way out down the stairs. Suddenly, the bizarre creature launched itself at Blunden, wrapping its body tightly around Blunden's neck. Martin stood in horror as he saw his shipmate struggling for life. But Martin, making the most of the opportunity to escape, abandoned his friend and ran from the scene as quickly as he could. There are two versions of the end of this story. The first is that Martin dashed past the hideous shape, made his way across the landing and down the stairs. Halfway down the stairs, he heard several hideous, deathly screams from his friend. As he left the house, he saw Blunden impaled on the railings, his neck broken, and his face a picture of absolute terror. Was he pushed, or did he jump? The second is that Martin left the house and raced to the nearest police station. When he returned accompanied by an officer, they found Blunden dead in the basement. As he left the house, Martin noticed a painting on the wall and shouted, "That's who attacked Edward, that's the attacker." The painting, it transpires, was none other than Thomas Myers, who had lived at the property and gone insane after he was jilted many years before. Is the nameless horror the strange apparition of the desperately sad and ultimately insane Thomas Myers, whose anger and sadness morphed into this bizarre ghoul? What do you think? It wasn't until 1879 that the property acquired new owners, Lady Bentley and her two teenage daughters, who'd moved to London from Sussex. The eldest daughter was rather unhappy with her room, complaining that it smelt like zoo animals in their cages, musty, repulsive, and unpleasant. One evening, as the eldest daughter waited for her betrothed, Captain Kentfield, to arrive, a maid named Emily Smithson was discovered in a guest room on the upper floor. She had collapsed and continually shouted, "Don't let it touch me, don't let it touch me." Like so many before her, Emily was declared insane and sent by a doctor to a sanatorium to end her days, and she died very shortly after this incident. Captain Kentfield arrived, and the household offered to make up a different room for him because of what happened to Emily, but Captain Kentfield insisted he wasn't scared. He did not believe in ghosts and had his pistol with him. Shortly after the captain retired to bed, screams and a single gunshot were heard from the top floor guest room. The ladies rushed up to find a disturbing and grisly sight. They discovered the dead body of Captain Kentfield lying face down in the guest room, the pistol still in his hand. No trace of the bullet was ever found. The cause of death was declared as fright. In 1969, an elderly clairvoyant named Mary Balfour told a reporter of a ghost that she witnessed in 1937. She recalled, "It was about the time of New Year, and I had come in late when my maid summoned me to the kitchen at the back of the flat. We could see into the back windows of a house opposite, and in one of them stood a man in a silver-coloured coat and breeches of 18th century cut, wearing a periwig and with a drawn, pale face. He was looking out sadly, not moving. It was only afterwards that I discovered the house was number 50. Believe it or not, I had not until that time heard of the reputation of the house." Does 50 Berkeley Square live up to its reputation as London's most haunted house? What could explain the nameless horror? Would you be brave enough to spend the night there? What do you think? I hope you enjoyed these bizarre stories from 50 Berkeley Square. I've got a few more little ghost stories for you and then some bits and pieces. And whilst there is speculation that the stories may have been exaggerated, it could be that something strange did occur in the home's early days. Is this just Victorian melodrama and gossip? Perhaps we'll never know. And in a way, it's a shame that so many of the witnesses were dead, drunk, mad, or a mixture of all three. Some people are convinced that the nameless horror is a demonic entity or elemental, and some of the descriptions really remind me of the aliens in H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds. It's particularly in Chapter 4 where the Martian spacecraft opens, the one that's crashed, and the Martian is described as being a rounded bulk the size of a bear, and that it has a round body, big eyes, and a mass of tentacles. It's a brilliant book. If you want to read it, you can also listen to the audiobook, which is on YouTube. Such a great storyteller. From the late 1930s until 2015, the premises was occupied by Maggs Brothers, antiquarian booksellers, founded in 1853 by Uriah Maggs, whose name does sound like something straight out of a Dickens novel. And for many years, the staff used to get asked all the time if the premises were haunted, and they said it wasn't. But in 2001, a cleaner was on her own preparing a room for a party, and she was completely convinced that something was standing behind her and began to feel really very uncomfortable, but there was nobody in the room. And around this time, one Saturday morning, a member of staff was working in the haunted bedroom that was utilised as an office, and he was startled by a column of brown mist that traversed the room and then vanished. And in another incident, a member of staff had their glasses snatched from, he had his glasses snatched from his hand as he walked up the stairs, and he found his glasses thrown at the bottom of the stairs. So perhaps there are some echoes of the property's haunted past still happening, even in modern times. In the late 1920s, Harry Price, he has to get involved somehow, decided to investigate 50 Berkeley Square and was very curious as to why such an impressive house was empty for such long periods of time. He felt that there was a poltergeist activity centred on the house itself, rather than on individual people. Harry Price was convinced that the haunting was caused by an extremely malevolent poltergeist, and that given the right environment, a strong enough poltergeist might well be able to cause that amount of havoc. There are those who believe that during the late 18th century, a gang of coin forgers and coin clippers took over the premises illegally. They deliberately encouraged the ghostly tales and made noises to keep people away and to mask any suspicious noises they would make during their clandestine activity. I did see 50 Berkeley Square listed as a rental property on an estate agent's website, although I couldn't find the date for when it was available. It was listed as a furnished property at £3,000 a week or £13,000 per calendar month. So if you are looking for a new pad, why not rent it? I'm sure it would make a great Airbnb. I did also read that a company have proposed to turn number 49 and 50 Berkeley Square into a very high-end spa. The plan includes a spa, hydrotherapy pool, yoga studio, all of that sort of stuff. Whether this will go ahead or whether permission has been granted, I don't actually know, but I think the company proposing it were responsible for the spa at Claridge's, where a facial will cost you between £250 and £455. So if 50 Berkeley Square does become a spa, it's not going to be cheap. Can you imagine being in that swimming pool and watching the nameless horror slip into the swimming pool next to you? That would be fun. Well, maybe not. Slightly moving away from Berkeley Square, but still linked to Mayfair, I have these theatre leaflets which date from 1974, and there is a ghost story in relation to this. I absolutely love Cass Elliot, and I think it's so sad that she died at such a young age. And as a female vocalist, she was unbelievably talented. In 1974, the Mamas and the Papas had gone their separate way, and Cass Elliot came to the UK to perform at the London Palladium for 2 weeks. She had a standing ovation on her last night and made an elated phone call to Michelle Phillips. That evening, she attended several parties, including Mick Jagger's 31st birthday, before returning to her Mayfair flat that she was borrowing from the singer Harry Nilsson. That night, she died in her sleep at the age of 32. And her body was returned to the United States. She was cremated at Hollywood Forever, and her ashes were then interred at Mount Sinai Memorial Park in Los Angeles. And oddly, 4 years later, Keith Moon, the drummer for The Who, died in the exact same bedroom as Cass, also at the age of 32. Anyhow, the ghost story relates to Cass Elliot's house in Laurel Canyon in Los Angeles. Cass Elliot had a number of houses in Los Angeles, but this was the one known for parties, and it was built in 1951. Before Cass Elliot owned it, it was owned by Natalie Wood, but when she married Robert Wagner, they moved to Beverly Hills, and the house was sold in the 1960s to Cass. And all her famous friends would party there, including Joni Mitchell, Frank Zappa, the Beatles, Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, Donovan, and Graham Parsons. Cass didn't have an address book and apparently had a graffiti wall in her living room where she'd ask her guests to write their names and phone numbers, and after she died, the property sold. And for a while, Ringo Starr lived there, and then Dan Aykroyd and his wife moved in. And Dan Aykroyd was absolutely convinced the property was haunted. And in an interview, Dan Aykroyd said the following: "A ghost certainly haunts my house. It once even crawled into bed with me. I rolled over and just nuzzled up to whatever it was and went back to sleep. The ghost also turns on the stairmaster and moves jewellery across the dresser. I'm sure it's Mama Cass, because you get the feeling it's a big ghost." Now, I'm just saying that those are his words, those are not my words, but that's what he said in the interview. He continues, "My wife and I were in bed and her jewellery did a little dance next to our bed. She saw it too. She had bracelets there, a pearl bracelet and a metal bracelet, and all of a sudden it was like they were doing a little mini cyclone. My daughter saw a red-haired man with a red-haired girl walking at the end of the hall, and the rumour was that somebody had died of a drug overdose in the house and was buried in it in the hillside. One of our friends, an ex-army boxing champion, scared of nothing, he saw a huge black mass moving across the stairway. We used to hear the stairmaster going on by itself. Numerous people said there was stuff going on in that house." And he also talked about selling the Cass residence and the fact that he had to disclose that there had been some unusual activity on the premises that could not be explained rationally or physically. The next buyer was the actress Beverly D'Angelo, who many of you will know from films like The National Lampoons. She paid $3.8 million for the property, and she also claimed to have witnessed paranormal activity. And she was interviewed for season 3 of an American program called Celebrity Ghost Stories, and I'll leave a link below, but she was adamant that she witnessed her jewellery physically moving on her mantelpiece. Not just moving or falling off, but physically moving and being rearranged, and she described it as freakish. When Dan Aykroyd lived there, he rented it for a time to the singer Robbie Williams, who only lived there for 3 months, and Robbie Williams claims to have had several experiences during that time. He stated, "I saw things moving around on our counter and doors opening and closing. The staff had experiences, direct contact in terms of tactile touching, and then turning around and there's no one there." And he also talked about a team of removal workers who point blank refused to go back into the house after they saw an old lady sitting in a chair, and one of Robbie Williams's friends living with him said that he had had a conversation with someone that wasn't there. So it sounds like this is quite an active house, and I really wanted to include the link between Mayfair and Los Angeles, and perhaps I will cover the ghosts of LA or Hollywood in the future if you are interested. Just another little Cass Elliot story for you from the time she lived in Laurel Canyon. First of all, she really had the hots for John Lennon, who was a frequent visitor to the house, and he drove an Alfa Romeo sports car. Now, Cass really loved this car, and she also went and bought a 1966 Porsche 911 with a sunroof, and also 2 Alfa Romeo Graduates. But there was a problem because she didn't know how to drive a car with a gear stick. So she needed a new driving instructor, and she picked up the phone and rang Peter Fonda, who came over and gave her lessons. And apparently one of Fonda's favourite memories was watching her drive around Laurel Canyon smiling with her hair blowing in the breeze and looking very, very happy. And she loved these European sports cars, and she just adored them. In 1969, the Manson family carried out the terrible murders of Sharon Tate and her companions, amongst other people, in Benedict Canyon in Los Angeles. And when the detectives entered the property to investigate, they found the piano in the lounge, and on it was the sheet music for Straight Shooter by the Mamas and the Papas. So a sad link to that story, really. If you are interested in that sort of culture of Laurel Canyon, I would highly recommend Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon by David McGowan, and also Laurel Canyon, I keep saying Lauren Canyon, that's not right. Laurel Canyon, The Inside Story of Rock and Roll by Michael Walker. Both of those you can get as a Kindle or as an audiobook. I've just got a couple of postcards for you today. The first one is from the Mayfair Hotel in Berkeley Square in London, and I chose this postcard because I just thought it was a really glamorous picture. I wonder what the event was. Look at those cars and how smartly dressed the chaps are in their top hats. Looks rather beautiful. The message on the back is a bit garbled. I didn't really buy it for the message, it was more for the image on the front. I think it's a really lovely little card. The Mayfair Hotel is on Stratton Street in London, and it opened in 1927 with King George V and Queen Mary in attendance, and today it is owned by the Radisson Group. I chose this postcard because I thought it was a little bit mysterious. It's addressed to the Lady Moira Scott, 16 Hertford Street. Now, 16 Hertford Street is an address in Mayfair, and all it says on it is Bon Voyage, mon petit chou. And I wonder who that's from. Is it an admirer? Is it her husband? Is it a lover? I just love the mystery connected with it, and that the address is in fact Mayfair. I tried to look up Lady Moira Scott. I couldn't find anything of her, so whether she actually is a lady or whether that's just his affectionate term for her, I don't know. I tried to get a menu from Claridge's, and I also tried to get one from the Connaught, but I couldn't get one. But I do have a little menu from the De Keyser's Royal Hotel, which was a large hotel on the Victoria Embankment, and it was founded around 1874 and catered mostly for visitors from continental Europe. By 1882, it had been expanded and became the largest hotel in London at that time, accommodating up to 480 guests. It suffered a serious decline after the First World War, and eventually it was sold to Lever Brothers in 1921, who demolished it in 1931 to make way for the construction of Unilever House, which stands on the site today. So, like the Cecil Hotel in my Theatre Royal Drury Lane video, this is another lost London landmark. So to begin, we've got potage Leopold, which I believe is a semolina soup with cream and lettuce. Got to be honest, I don't think I like the sound of that. Then we've got a clear soup with shredded vegetables, turbot with capers and apple, lamb chops with a sauce made of onions and cream, sorbet made with port, roasted Le Mans chicken with watercress, green beans and herbs, salmon salad, pears poached in a sauce made of strawberry and lemon, and ice cream, I assume, with tropical fruit. Quite a nice menu, I think. Well, that's it from me today. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to come and find me on Instagram. And take care, guys, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care.